This year at Brighton Women's Centre, we have been celebrating our 50th birthday. Looking back at our history, we've seen a tale of tenacity, strength, and most of all, survival. BWC has weathered many storms and encountered many highs and lows. This is also the story of women's fight for equality over the past 5 decades. Today, you will hear from Dr. Mary Ann Stephenson, Director of the Women's Budget Group, the UK's leading feminist economic think tank. This International Women's Day campaign theme is Accelerate Action, emphasising the importance of taking swift and decisive steps to achieve gender equality. What role do the Women's Budget Group play as a think tank in trying to accelerate action?
So I think we see ourselves as having a number of roles. I mean, first of all, what we do is we provide evidence for the women's sector. We provide evidence and analysis of the impact that economic policy has on women and men and different groups of women and men. So we look at government proposals. We look at things like the spring statement that's coming out shortly, or the spending review. We also look at things like the proposals for disability benefit changes that were made by the government. And we analyse how that will affect different groups of people. And so that's as a resource to help inform other people's kind of campaigning and lobbying. Secondly, we lobby, we raise issues in Parliament, we push for changes and for policies that we think will improve the lives of women and improve gender equality. So we don't just analyse other people's proposals, we come up with proposals of our own. But thirdly, we're not just a think tank. So one of our objectives is to try and help grassroots women's organisations, individual women, women's campaigns to find and use local data for themselves. If we just say, oh, come to us, we're the experts, that reinforces the idea that economics is something, complicated and difficult, and you need specialist knowledge to do it. And actually, a lot of the time you don't, you just need to know where to look for the numbers. So we can help show people, for example, how to work out what the pay gap is in their city, what number of women in their local authority area experience domestic or sexual violence, how affordable childcare is in their town, or how affordable housing is in their town. And so we run workshops where we show people how to find the data and what they can do with it. And all of that, I think, is about enabling other people to push for the sorts of changes that they want to see. So we know that there's lots of grassroots and frontline organisations, for example, that have got a huge amount of evidence from their own experience, the evidence from their members or people they provide services to. But that can often be dismissed as anecdotal by policymakers. So being able to combine that with the numbers can be really, really powerful, and we help people to do that.
Considering the financial position of women over the last 50 years, how does the cost of living crisis compare with previous periods in history for women?
So, I think it's important to recognise that women's lives have changed really dramatically over the last 50 years, particularly in terms of participation in the labour market. The pay gap has narrowed significantly. More women are in paid work, so more women are likely to have an income in their own right. However, there's other things like, for example, housing costs, which have outpaced the increase in wages so dramatically that even though more women are in the paid workforce than ever before, housing is less affordable for women. And we did some research which showed that there isn't a single region in England where a median house to rent is affordable for a woman on her own on a median income. And that's a major problem. Even prior to the cost of living increase, we saw significant cuts to the income and the living standards of large numbers of women, particularly the poorest, as a result of austerity policies from 2010. So we know that austerity hits poorer households harder than richer households. It hit women harder than men in every single income group. And it hit Black and Asian women harder than white women. So we went into the cost of living crisis with, significant numbers of women, particularly the poorest women, already having a much lower income than they would have had things remained the same as in 2010. And so the cost of living crisis was a crisis of incomes as well as prices. It wasn't just that prices went up, it was that people's incomes had not increased in real terms, and for the poorest had actually fallen in real terms as a result of austerity and COVID and the overall direction of the economy. So it's kind of a mixed picture. You can't say, oh, women are better off than they were 50 years ago, because in some ways they are, but in some ways they're not. And certainly over the last 15 years or so, women have been hit disproportionately by cuts to spending on public services and on social security.
Recognising unpaid care work is central to feminist economics. Why is this so fundamental to the economy, and how can it be better recognised?
Okay, so women do significantly more unpaid work than men, over 50% more unpaid work than men. And most of that work is care work or work involved with caring for other people. So, housework, cooking, cleaning, all of those sorts of things, which you have to do more of if you've got somebody to look after. And that means that women have less time for paid work. So they tend to work fewer hours than men. And part-time work is less well paid per hour and less well paid overall. So they tend to have lower incomes, which means they tend to be dependent on social security for a higher proportion of their income. But also because women do unpaid care for nothing in the home, the skills involved in that sort of work tend to be undervalued. So we tend to think that caring is just something that women do naturally, and therefore we don't recognise the skills involved. So care work is badly paid compared to a lot of other sectors of the economy. And at the same time, employers often discriminate against women in the labour market, either because they've got caring responsibilities or because they think they might have caring responsibilities in the future. So, for example, even women who don't have children, who have no intention of having children or can't have children, employers may think that they might go on maternity leave at some point in the future and therefore be wary of suggesting them for promotion. And then there's practical impacts as well. So because of care, women tend to work in jobs that are closer to their homes than men do. Women's commuting distance is shorter than that of men, which means the pool of jobs they've got to choose from is smaller. Women have less time to get involved in politics and public life, which means the majority of decision makers are men. And because women do most of the caring, there's a sort of reproducing cycle, which is that care is seen as primarily a woman's responsibility. And all of these things mean that women end up differently situated in the economy to men. So women work in different sectors, they tend to earn less, they tend to own less, they're more likely to be poor, they're more likely to be in debt, particularly debt for meeting their basic needs. Not counting things like a mortgage, which you might see as a debt that you take on that gives you an asset over time, but debt to pay basic bills. And that means that economic policy impacts women differently to men. So when I said earlier women were hit harder by austerity than men, it was because of their caring responsibilities. And so unless we recognise that, we're likely to come up with policies that don't work for women in the same way that they work for men. For example, there's an assumption that if you can get people out of unemployment and into low paid work, they will then progress into better paid jobs. But women actually experience what's called sticky floors. So they're more likely to get stuck in low paid and insecure work. And so if you bring all of that together, you've got a situation where women are disadvantaged in the formal paid economy because of their work in the unpaid economy. And that's bad for women, but it's also bad for the economy overall. You know, we have a weaker economy because of the untapped labour of women, because women aren't able to fully participate. But at the same time, that care work is important work. You know, a healthy society needs healthy, well cared for, well educated individuals. A healthy economy needs a healthy, well cared for workforce. So it's not like we can simply say, oh, we just need to get rid, you know, stop women doing that unpaid work, and get them into the labour market and everything will be fine, because that work needs to be done. People need looking after, children need looking after, old people need looking after, you know, disabled people need care. So we need to think about how we can better redistribute that work, both between kind of individuals and society as a whole. So providing paid for care services, for example, that enable people greater choice about how they provide care, but also between women and men. If women are to have equality in the formal economy, in the paid labour force, then we need to have equality in the unpaid economy and in the home. And that means men need to do more. So care is absolutely fundamental, both to women's economic position, but also to our economy as a whole.
BWC is one of the oldest women's centres in the UK and one of only a few remaining that still provide on-site low-cost childcare. Childcare remains a key consideration in building a gender equal economy. What would the Women's Budget Group like to see change?
So we know that our early education and childcare system is in crisis. The Women's Budget Group houses the Early Education and Childcare Coalition, which brings together a whole range of different organisations with an interest in childcare. You know, organisations representing providers, organisations representing workers, so trade unions, organisations representing parents, children's organisations, women's organisations. And we've identified that what we need is both rescue and reform for our childcare sector. So in the short term, we need rescue. You said yourself that BWC is one of the few women's centres that actually provides on-site childcare. We know that lots of childcare providers, particularly in the kind of voluntary sector, have been really squeezed because the funding that the government provides for the so-called free hours isn't enough to cover the cost of those hours, which means that they have to cross-subsidise by charging more for other hours. That makes childcare unaffordable for large numbers of people. There's parts of the country where, you know, childcare costs people more than their mortgage does. For children with special educational needs, childcare is often inaccessible. There's often, childcare doesn't meet the needs of those children. And the so-called free hours from the government actually excludes many of the poorest children from accessing the benefits of early education. So, you know, the number of hours you can get if you're not in paid work, for example, is limited, or if you're a student, the number of hours you get is limited. So there needs to be kind of short-term rescue to put more money into the system. But in the longer term, we need to think about childcare and early education in a different way. So we need to recognise it as an investment, and we need to think about how our system is structured. You know, there are very many brilliant childcare providers up and down the country who work incredibly hard and are really dedicated to providing the best services they can. But we also know that there are some, you know, big like hedge fund investors putting money into buying up early years providers because they see that as an investment. We shouldn't be seeing childcare as an investment in that way. We should see it as a shared investment in the well-being of our society, not a way to make large amounts of money. We have always argued for a system of free universal childcare, which we think would have huge benefits, not just for women, but for the economy as as a whole, it would create more jobs. It would enable more women to enter the labour market. It would reduce the benefits bill because people are able to work and therefore less dependent on benefits. It would increase tax income for the government because people who are working are paying taxes. So a large amount of the costs would actually be met by those economic benefits. And we think it should be seen as an important investment to kind of underpin a healthy economy.
At BWC, one of the key impacts we hope to have is that the women we work with feel heard. What key recommendation would the Women's Budget Group like to be heard in 2025?
I think our key recommendation is that actually a healthy economy needs investment in social infrastructure. So at the moment, the government is arguing that what we need to do is get economic growth. And then when we have economic growth, we can have more money for public services. We think that's the wrong way round. We think you won't get a healthy economy unless you invest in the infrastructure that underpins it. And that's not just physical infrastructure. So it's not just, roads and rail and telecoms. It is a social infrastructure. It's health and care and education. And so if that would be the one message that could be heard from the government, I think that would be it.